Louisiana, 1944. The humidity hung thick as syrup over Camp Livingston, turning the air into something you could almost drink, while mosquitoes hummed in clouds above the standing water that pooled between barracks. 200 German prisoners stood in formation beneath live oaks draped with Spanish moss, their faces pale and bewildered, their uniforms still carrying salt stains from the Atlantic crossing. They had been told Americans were barbarians. Then the guards invited them to supper. The camp sprawled across piney woods north of Alexandria, where the earth turned red and the Kisatchie forest pressed close against wire fences that seemed almost decorative in the thick green wilderness. The prisoners had arrived 3 days earlier, exhausted from transport, disoriented by heat that felt like standing inside an open mouth. Most had been captured in North Africa, taken at Kasserine Pass or during the long retreat from El Alamein. They had expected execution or labor camps. They had not expected guards who spoke in drawling rhythms they could barely understand, who smiled easily, who seemed more interested in teaching them to play baseball than enforcing discipline. The first morning had been the strangest. Reveille came at 0600, the prisoners assembling in formation as they had been trained, expecting the brutality their officers had promised. Instead, the American guards offered coffee. Real coffee, hot and strong, served in tin cups with sugar available for anyone who wanted it. The Germans stood uncertain, looking at the cups, at each other, waiting for the trap to spring. It never did. The guards simply drank their own coffee and gestured for the prisoners to do the same. Private Werner Koch, 22 years old from Hamburg, had been trained as a panzer mechanic before his capture. He stood in that first formation, holding the tin cup like it might explode, the steam rising into morning air already thick with humidity. The coffee tasted better than anything he'd had in 2 years of war. That was the first crack in his certainty. The propaganda had promised American weakness, American chaos, American cruelty masquerading as civilization. This coffee suggested something different: competence, abundance, a kind of casual generosity that didn't compute with everything he'd been taught. The barracks themselves were another shock. Clean wooden structures with screens on the windows, bunks with actual mattresses, latrines that flushed. In North Africa, they had lived in tents when they were lucky, in foxholes when they weren't. Here they had buildings that wouldn't have shamed a German garrison. The cognitive dissonance built with every detail. These were not the facilities you provided for men you considered subhuman. These were accommodations for soldiers, for human beings deserving of basic dignity. Corporal James Thibodeau walked the perimeter at dawn, his boots leaving prints in red mud, his rifle slung loose over one shoulder. He had grown up 20 miles south, in Bunkie, where his family had been trapping and fishing since before Louisiana was a state. The war had taken him to basic training at Fort Polk, then back here, guarding men who had been shooting at his cousins in France. The irony wasn't lost on him. Neither was the opportunity. His father had taught him that you measured a man by how he treated people who couldn't fight back. His grandmother, who still spoke more French than English, had taught him that food was the first language of civilization, that you could tell everything about a culture by what they ate and how they shared it. Thibodeau carried both lessons into his work as a guard, watching these German prisoners with curiosity rather than hatred, seeing in their confused faces the same bewilderment any man would feel when stripped of everything familiar and dropped into Louisiana summer. He had noticed things the other guards missed. The way the Germans stood at attention even when not ordered to, the military bearing so ingrained it operated on autopilot. The way they organized themselves by rank even in casual moments, maintaining hierarchies that seemed absurd in a prison camp. The way they watched everything with suspicious eyes, waiting for American savagery that never materialized. Thibodeau understood they were operating from propaganda, from lies told so many times they had calcified into truth. He understood because his own training had tried the same thing, tried to reduce these men to monsters worthy only of bullets. But he had grown up in a place where German immigrants had settled in the 1800s, where names like Zimmermann and Müller appeared on gravestones in the Catholic cemetery, where the distinction between German and American seemed like an accident of geography rather than a fundamental divide. His best friend in grade school had been Otto Brenner, grandson of German immigrants, who spoke English with a Cajun accent and loved crawfish as much as any native. The war had complicated that friendship but hadn't destroyed it. Otto was somewhere in the Pacific, Thibodeau was here guarding Germans, and the whole situation seemed increasingly absurd the more he thought about it. The German prisoners worked the camp gardens, tended livestock, repaired roads under guard details that felt more like supervision than imprisonment. The work was hard, but the treatment was fair, almost gentle, a sharp contrast to everything their training had promised about American brutality. Sergeant Klaus Zimmermann, captured outside Tunis, wrote letters to his wife describing the strangeness. "The guards joke with us," he wrote in cramped script. "They share cigarettes and ask about Germany as if we are simply soldiers from different places, not enemies. I do not understand this war anymore." The work details revealed America in ways propaganda couldn't counter. The camp gardens produced vegetables in quantities that seemed impossible. Tomatoes, beans, squash, okra growing in the rich soil with minimal effort. The prisoners had been told America was on the verge of starvation, that the home front was collapsing under the weight of war production. Yet here were gardens that produced surplus, food so abundant the guards gave excess to local churches. Zimmermann had helped tend a victory garden in Hamburg before deployment. It had produced sparse crops from exhausted soil. These Louisiana gardens exploded with life. The livestock operation was another revelation. Chickens that laid eggs daily, pigs that grew fat on scraps, a few cows that provided milk for the camp kitchen. The prisoners detailed to animal care learned American farming methods that emphasized efficiency without cruelty, productivity through good husbandry, rather than forced extraction. Koch, the former Panzer mechanic, found himself mucking stalls and discovered he preferred it to tank maintenance. The animals didn't care about ideology. They just needed food and water and decent treatment. It was refreshingly simple. Some prisoners resisted the cognitive dissonance. Unteroffizier Franz Adler, a committed Nazi who had joined the party at 16, maintained that this was all theater, that the real brutality would come later. He refused to fraternize with guards, refused to learn English beyond necessary commands, spent his evenings in the barracks writing screeds about American decadence and weakness. But even Adler couldn't deny the evidence accumulating around him. The food was good, the work was fair, the treatment was humane. His certainty eroded slowly, like limestone under patient water, though he fought it every day. The heat built through April and May, transforming the camp into a steam bath, where men moved slowly and drank water by the gallon. The German prisoners struggled with the climate, their northern European blood unprepared for Louisiana summer. Guards watched them carefully for heat stroke, adjusted work schedules, made sure water was always available. This too confused the prisoners. They had been taught that mercy was weakness. Here it seemed as natural as breathing. By late May, the crawfish were running. Thibodeau knew this without checking, knew it in his bones the way his father and grandfather had known it, the seasonal rhythm as reliable as tides. He approached Captain William Habert, the camp commander, with an idea that would have seemed insane anywhere else but Louisiana. A crawfish boil for the prisoners. A taste of what made this place different from everywhere else in the world. Captain Habert was from Lafayette, Cajun to his core, and he understood immediately what Thibodeau was proposing. Not just food, culture, a moment of communion that transcended war and propaganda and the machinery of hatred that had brought these men to this place. He approved it without hesitation, then sent word to town for supplies. The war could spare one evening for remembering that enemies were also men. The preparations began that afternoon. Guards hauled in 40-pound sacks of live crawfish, their claws clicking and snapping, their muddy smell mixing with the scent of pine and standing water. They brought propane burners and enormous pots, corn and potatoes and onions, lemons and oranges halved and ready. The spice blend came from Thibodeau's mother, a secret family recipe written in measurements that made sense only to those raised with it. A handful of this, a good bit of that. Enough cayenne to make you remember you're alive. Thibodeau's mother had driven up from Bunkie that morning with the spices in mason jars, along with 3 dozen lemons from her tree, and advice delivered in rapid French-inflected English. "You make sure them boys get enough lemon," she told him, waving a finger for emphasis. "And don't be stingy with the cayenne. Ain't no point in crawfish if it don't make you sweat a little." She had looked at the camp, at the wire fences and guard towers, and shaken her head. "You feeding prisoners with this? Well, I guess hospitality don't stop for war. Your papa would approve. He always said good food was the best weapon against meanness." The crawfish themselves came from the Atchafalaya Basin, trapped that morning by cousins who made their living on the water. 200 pounds of prime crawfish, purged clean in fresh water, their claws banded, ready for the pot. They were perfect specimens, the kind that would bring premium prices in New Orleans restaurants. Thibodeau had called in favors to get them, had promised reciprocity, had explained that he was feeding German prisoners and needed the crawfish to be exceptional. His cousins had looked at him like he'd lost his mind, then shrugged in that particularly Cajun way that suggested the world was too strange to question anymore. The prisoners watched these preparations with growing confusion and something else. Hunger. Real hunger. Not the abstract need for calories, but the specific anticipation that comes from smelling good food being prepared with care. They had been eating well by POW standards. The camp kitchen served balanced meals, adequate portions, nothing to complain about officially. But this was different. This was food prepared with love, with tradition, with the intention of creating not just sustenance but experience. The German prisoners watched these preparations with growing confusion. Some suspected poison. Others thought it was a test of some kind. None could understand why their guards were working this hard to prepare food for them. Zimmerman stood near the barracks with 3 other sergeants, watching Thibodeau arrange crawfish in sorting baskets, and felt something close to fear. In his experience, kindness always preceded cruelty. This felt too elaborate to be genuine. Evening came soft and golden, the light slanting through the pines in columns that made the moss glow silver. The air cooled slightly, though the humidity remained thick as wool. Thibodeau lit the burners and the flames roared to life, blue and orange tongues licking at the bottom of the pots. He filled them with water from the camp well, added salt by the scoop, then began building the seasoning base that would transform simple ingredients into something transcendent. The smell started slowly, onions and garlic hitting hot water, releasing oils that drifted through the camp like invisible smoke. Then cayenne and paprika, black pepper and bay leaves, the spices blooming in the heat. The prisoners began gathering without orders, drawn by curiosity and the primal response to cooking food. They stood at a distance, watching guards dump crawfish into boiling water, watching the creatures turn from brown to brilliant red, watching vegetables go in after, watching the pots come off the burners to steep in their own heat. Thibodeau spread newspapers across camp tables, long sheets of print that would serve as plates and tablecloths both. Other guards brought out the first pot, tilted it carefully, and the crawfish poured out in a steaming cascade of red and orange, corn and potatoes tumbling after, the smell hitting like a physical force, rich and spicy and complex, carrying undertones of river and earth, sharp with cayenne and round with garlic, unlike anything the prisoners had ever encountered. No one moved at first. The Germans stood in uncertain clusters, looking at the food, at the guards, at each other. Then Thibodeau grabbed a crawfish, demonstrated the twist and suck technique, the way you separated tail from head and drew out the meat with your teeth. He grinned, juice running down his chin, and gestured for them to try. "Y'all gonna let it get cold?" he asked, his accent so thick the words barely translated. "Come on now, ain't gonna hurt you none." Zimmerman stepped forward first. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up a crawfish, still hot enough to make his fingers sting. He fumbled with it, unsure of the mechanics, until a guard showed him again. Twist, pull, suck. The meat came away and he tasted it, expecting nothing, prepared for disappointment. What he got instead was revelation. The flavor exploded across his tongue, spicy but not overwhelming, rich with butter and garlic, The crawfish meat sweet and tender, unlike anything from Germany's rivers and lakes. The heat built slowly, cayenne blooming in the back of his throat, making his eyes water, but not from pain. From something else. From the shock of being in a prison camp eating food this good, prepared by guards who had no reason to care whether their enemies enjoyed dinner. Zimmerman stood there for a moment, the crawfish tail in his hand, trying to process what he was tasting. It wasn't just the flavor, though that was extraordinary. It was the complexity of it, the layers of spice and aromatics, the way the butter and lemon cut through the richness, the way the crawfish itself tasted of Louisiana water and Louisiana earth, carrying terroir like fine wine. He had eaten in good restaurants in Berlin before the war. This was better. This was food made by people who understood it bone deep, who had been preparing it since childhood, who measured ingredients by instinct rather than recipe. He reached for another crawfish, and another. The mechanics became easier with practice, the twist and pull and suck of it, the efficient extraction of meat from shell. Around him, the dam was breaking in stages. Coke grabbed a crawfish tentatively, fumbled through eating it, then reached for 3 more in rapid succession. Another prisoner, Gefreiter Otto Schreiber, sat down hard on a bench with a crawfish in each hand, and a look on his face like he'd been struck by lightning. Adler, the committed Nazi, held out longer than the others. He stood at the edge of the gathering, arms crossed, watching his fellow prisoners abandon dignity for shellfish. This was weakness, he told himself. This was fraternization with the enemy. This was exactly the kind of American corruption his training had warned about. Then the wind shifted and the smell hit him full force, cayenne and garlic and butter and something indefinably delicious, and his stomach betrayed his ideology with a growl that could be heard 3 meters away. Thibodeau noticed Adler standing apart. He grabbed a plate, loaded it with crawfish and corn, walked over and held it out without a word. Adler stared at the offered food, at the guard's face showing nothing but casual hospitality, at the moment that would define whether he held to principle or admitted he was just a hungry man being offered supper. His hands shook slightly as he took the plate. His voice, when he spoke, came out barely above a whisper. Danke. The first crawfish was a surrender. Adler knew it as soon as the flavor hit him. As soon as he understood that Louisiana in a prison camp tasted better than victory in Berlin ever had. His ideology began cracking in that moment, fault lines spreading through certainty like lightning through glass. By his 3rd crawfish, tears were running down his face too, though he turned away so no one would see. By his 10th, he had stopped caring who saw. The war was over for Franz Adler. It had been over since Tunis, but he hadn't admitted it until this moment. Sitting at a newspaper-covered table eating Louisiana crawfish prepared by guards who treated enemies like guests. Adler, the committed Nazi, held out longer than the others. He stood at the edge of the gathering, arms crossed, watching his fellow prisoners abandon dignity for shellfish. This was weakness, he told himself. This was fraternization with the enemy. This was exactly the kind of American corruption his training had warned about. Then the wind shifted, and the smell hit him full force, cayenne and garlic and butter and something indefinably delicious, and his stomach betrayed his ideology with a growl that could be heard 3 meters away. The dam broke. Other prisoners moved forward, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. They grabbed crawfish and corn, potatoes soaked in spiced butter, oranges and lemons to cut the heat. The newspaper-covered tables filled with men eating with their hands, juice running down wrists. The mechanical efficiency of German military training abandoned in favor of messy, primal enjoyment. The guards moved among them, demonstrating techniques, laughing at clumsy attempts, encouraging everyone to eat more. Private Hans Müller, 19 years old and captured on his first deployment, sat at a table with crawfish shells piling in front of him and tears streaming down his face. He wasn't alone. Around the camp, men were crying while they ate the emotional release coming in waves that had nothing to do with cayenne, and everything to do with the sudden overwhelming dissolution of everything they had been taught to believe about this enemy. Müller had been drafted at 17, trained for 6 months, and shipped to North Africa with promises that he was joining a glorious crusade. His actual war had lasted 3 weeks before British artillery caught his position, and he surrendered with shrapnel in his leg and terror in his heart. He had expected execution, had been prepared for it, in the way you prepare for inevitable things. Instead, he got medical treatment, then transport to America, then this camp where guards fed him crawfish and asked about his hometown like they actually cared. The tears came from somewhere deep and unexpected, from the relief of being alive when he should be dead, from the confusion of receiving kindness from people he'd been trained to hate, from the simple, overwhelming experience of eating food prepared with love and skill by people who gained nothing from it, except the satisfaction of feeding hungry men well. His mother used to cook like this, before rationing, before the war consumed everything including joy. Sitting here eating crawfish in Louisiana, Muller felt homesick for a Germany that didn't exist anymore, maybe never had. Across the table, Schreiber was laughing and crying simultaneously, crawfish juice running down his chin, his hands moving automatically from pile to mouth while his mind processed the impossibility of this moment. He was a printer from Munich, captured during the same offensive as Muller, 32 years old with a wife and daughter he hadn't seen in 18 months. The Red Cross letters came monthly, censored and brief, telling him his family was fine, though he knew Munich was being bombed regularly. His daughter was 6 now. She wouldn't remember him when he got home. If he got home. But here, eating crawfish with guards who treated him like a dinner guest rather than a prisoner, Schreiber felt something like hope. These Americans weren't monsters. They were just people, complicated and generous and skilled at things like crawfish boils and making prisoners feel momentarily human. If America was like this, maybe the war wasn't the righteous struggle propaganda claimed. Maybe Germany was wrong. Maybe he had been wrong. The thought was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. They had been told Americans were soft and decadent. These guards had spent hours preparing food for prisoners. They had been told American soldiers were cowards who relied on material advantage. These men worked the boil with the same competence they brought to everything else, moving with practiced efficiency born from generations of tradition. They had been told Americans had no culture worth respecting. This meal proved otherwise. The evening deepened toward night. Fireflies appeared in the trees, their lights pulsing yellow-green against the darkness. More pots came off the burners. More crawfish and vegetables poured onto tables. The guards eating alongside the prisoners now, sharing space and food and conversation, attempted through language barriers and generous use of hand gestures. Music started somewhere. A guard with a harmonica playing slow blues that drifted through the camp like smoke. Thibodeau sat with Zimmerman and 3 other German sergeants, working through a pile of crawfish and trying to explain Louisiana through broken English and gestures. He talked about the bayous, about growing up on water that moved so slow you couldn't see it flowing, about catching crawfish as a boy, about family boils that lasted all day, about the way food could bind people together across any divide. Zimmerman listened and ate and felt his understanding of the war shifting beneath him like sand. By midnight, the tables were buried under crawfish shells, mountains of red carapaces and empty claws, corn cobs stripped clean, potato skins discarded. The prisoners were full in a way most hadn't been since before the war, their stomachs tight with good food, their minds reeling from hospitality. They couldn't reconcile with propaganda's promises. They sat in small groups, talking quietly, processing the evening's revelation. Captain Hebert watched from the command building, smoking a cigarette, observing the scene with satisfaction that went beyond simple feeding of prisoners. He had grown up knowing the power of a good meal, of gathering around food and remembering humanity in the face of everything that tried to strip it away. This was Louisiana's weapon against hatred, not violence, not punishment, simple, overwhelming generosity that made enemies reconsider. The cleanup took hours. Prisoners and guards worked together, gathering newspapers heavy with shells, scrubbing pots, washing down tables. The work happened in comfortable silence, the kind that settles between people who have shared something meaningful. By 2 in the morning, the camp was clean, the evidence of the feast reduced to lingering smells of spice and wood smoke. Zimmerman couldn't sleep. He sat on his bunk writing letters by flashlight, trying to explain the evening to his wife, struggling to find German words for Louisiana concepts that didn't translate. "They gave us a feast," he wrote. "Our guards, the enemy, spent their evening teaching us to eat like Louisianans. I have never tasted anything like it. I have never felt more confused about this war. How do you hate men who treat prisoners like honored guests?" The crawfish boil became camp legend. Other POW facilities heard about it through official channels and informal networks, the story spreading with the kind of speed that attaches to things that seem too strange to believe. Some commanders dismissed it as weakness. Others saw it as Hebert did, as a weapon more powerful than barbed wire and guard towers. You couldn't hate people who fed you like family. Through the summer, the tradition continued. Monthly crawfish boils, the prisoners learning the rhythms and techniques, beginning to help with preparation. They learned to purge crawfish, to season pots, to judge doneness by color and feel. They learned Louisiana songs and figured out how to drink beer that tasted nothing like German lager. They learned that America was more than the propaganda promised, more complex and more generous, and more willing to see enemies as simply men from elsewhere. The psychological impact rippled outward in ways the camp administrators barely understood. Escape attempts from Camp Livingston fell to zero. Work details became more cooperative. The prisoners began teaching guards German, learning English in return, the language barrier dissolving in the face of genuine relationship. Letters home changed tone. German families reading accounts that contradicted everything their government told them about American brutality. Wehrmacht intelligence officers interviewing repatriated prisoners flagged Camp Livingston repeatedly. The prisoners spoke too fondly of their captivity. They described treatment that sounded like propaganda, impossible to believe. Some had to be questioned multiple times before intelligence officers accepted that yes, American guards really did throw crawfish boils for prisoners. Yes, they really were treated with that much consideration. Yes, the experience had fundamentally altered their view of the enemy. One prisoner, returned to Germany in a late war exchange, refused to take up arms again. He went AWOL within a week, was captured, and told his interrogators that he wouldn't fight Americans. Not after Louisiana. Not after guards who treated him better than his own officers had. The interrogation report noted this as evidence of sophisticated psychological warfare. It wasn't. It was just crawfish and kindness. After the war, some of the Camp Livingston prisoners stayed in Louisiana. They married local women, started businesses, integrated into communities that remembered them as the Germans from the camp who learned to love crawfish. Zimmerman returned to Germany, rebuilt his life, but wrote to Thibodeau for 30 years, letters that started "Dear Friend," and always included questions about crawfish season, about the bayous, about whether the live oaks still looked the same. The reunion happened in 1974, 30 years after the first boil. Zimmerman flew to Louisiana with his wife, nervous about returning to a place that held such complicated memories. Thibodeau met them at the airport, older now, his hair gone white, but his smile the same. They drove to what had been Camp Livingston, abandoned since 1945. The barracks collapsed and the fences rusted, pine trees reclaiming the space where men had once confronted the dissolution of propaganda. They held a boil anyway. Right there in the overgrown camp, Thibodeau bringing burners and pots, Zimmerman bringing his wife and children, both men bringing the weight of 3 decades and a friendship born from crawfish and the courage to see humanity across wire fences. They boiled crawfish the way they had in 1944, the smell drifting through ruins, and ate surrounded by ghosts of the men they had been. Zimmerman's wife asked what made the food so special. Thibodeau thought about it while cracking a crawfish, looking at the red shells and remembering 200 German faces seeing them for the first time. "It ain't just the crawfish," he said finally. "It's what happens when you sit down with someone and share something real. Food like this, it reminds you that the person across from you, enemy or not, they got a mama who taught them to eat. They got memories of good meals. They got the same human things you got. Hard to keep hating someone when you're both covered in crawfish juice and grinning about it." The academic study came later, in the 1980s, when historians began seriously examining POW treatment during World War II. Camp Livingston appeared in multiple dissertations, the crawfish boils analyzed as primitive cultural diplomacy, as psychological warfare, as evidence of American exceptionalism. The prisoners interviewed for these studies pushed back against the analysis. It wasn't strategy, they insisted. It was just people being decent, just Louisiana being Louisiana, just guards who remembered that enemies were still human. The tradition continues in unexpected ways. Every year, the Louisiana National Guard hosts a crawfish boil at the site of the old camp, inviting German military attachés, historians, descendants of guards and prisoners both. They spread newspapers on tables in the exact spot where the first boil happened. They season crawfish with recipes passed down from Thibodeau's family, and they remember. Not just the war. The moment when food and kindness proved stronger than propaganda. Captain Hebert wrote about it once in 1952, in a letter to a researcher studying POW camps. "You have to understand," he wrote, "we didn't do it to win hearts and minds or whatever the military calls it now. We did it because it was crawfish season, and we're Louisiana people. And that's what you do, you boil crawfish. You share with whoever's around. Didn't matter they were Germans, they were here, they were hungry, and we knew how to fix both those problems. Everything else, the friendship and the changed perspectives and all that just happened natural-like, the way things do when people eat good food together." The final reunion happened in 2003, organized by descendants when Zimmerman passed away at 84. His children brought his ashes to Louisiana, to the site of Camp Livingston, to the place that had transformed their father from a committed Nazi soldier into a man who believed in basic human decency above national loyalty. Thibodeau was there at 91, frail but clear-eyed, to receive them. They scattered Zimmerman's ashes near the old kitchen area, where the boils had happened, where propaganda had died over steaming pots of seasoned crawfish. Then they held one more boil, 3 generations eating together, Germans and Americans and Cajuns, the crawfish seasoned exactly right, the beer cold, the evening soft with Louisiana humidity. Thibodeau told stories about the camp, about watching German faces when they first tasted crawfish, about the night he knew the war had already ended in the only way that mattered. The lesson lived in those stories, in the way food could accomplish what diplomacy couldn't, in the recognition that some things transcended war and nation and propaganda. Crawfish boiled in cayenne and garlic, shared between enemies, had proved stronger than years of indoctrination. Not because the food was magical, because the act of sharing it, of sitting together in vulnerability and enjoyment, reminded everyone involved that underneath uniforms and languages and political systems, humanity persisted. Camp Livingston is gone now. The barracks rotted, the fences sold for scrap, the land returned to pine forest and the slow encroachment of Louisiana wilderness. But the memory holds. In German towns where former prisoners settled, in Louisiana families who remember grandparents talking about the camp, in military academies where the story gets told as example of unconventional tactics, the crawfish boil lives on. The photographs survive too. Black and white images of Germans and Americans around newspaper-covered tables, everyone covered in crawfish juice, everyone grinning. The pictures don't capture the smell or the taste or the sound of men laughing in 2 languages at once, but they capture something else. The moment when war's divisions dissolved over shared food, when enemies remembered they were all just men far from home, when Louisiana's simple generosity proved that some human connections run deeper than any ideology. Thibodeau passed in 2008, his funeral attended by more Germans than locals, descendants of prisoners coming to pay respects to the guard who had fed their fathers and taught them that Americans weren't what propaganda promised. They held a crawfish boil after, because that's what you do for a Louisiana man who spent his life proving that food and kindness can change the world. The crawfish were perfect. The company was better. And somewhere in the steam rising off those pots, in the smell of cayenne and garlic drifting through afternoon heat, The ghosts of 200 German prisoners and their Cajun guards sat down together one more time to remember the meal that changed everything.